Hello everyone and welcome to another video! Today I thought we'd take a look at another coaster project that's one stage up from the last one that we did. Last time we focused very much on shapes and the arrangement for the absolute beginner mosaicist, and this time we're going to be creating that really familiar crazy paving style that's so closely associated with mosaics. Still sticking with the coaster project though, because it's nice and small and relatively quick to create. But before we start, let's take a look at what we're going to need. Firstly, you will be wanting a blank coaster. This is a plain wooden circle that's about 10 centimeters in diameter. I'm using an MDF blank that's advertised for pyrography, but it's perfectly good for mosaics too. Next, you're going to need some tiles, and I'm using my favourite 2x2 centimeter unglazed terracotta tiles. But you can use vitreous glass or anything else that takes your fancy really. You can mix and match different types of tile, but if you do, just make sure they're all the same depth, because you want it to be an even surface if you're going to be putting a mug on it. Depending on the type of tile you've chosen, you're going to want some nippers, and I'm working with unglazed terracotta, so I'm going to be using standard nippers. You're also going to be wanting some glue. PVA is perfectly good for a coaster project as it dries nice and firmly, but it's not too quick at drying, and so you'll have some time to rearrange tiles if you need to. We're also going to be using grout, obviously. You can either use the pre-mixed kind or the powdered. In this case, I'm going to be using a pre-mixed one. And for safety, it is well worth wearing goggles when you're cutting tiles because bits can flirt off in all different directions, and if it gets in your eyes, it can obviously do some really quite serious damage. Also, it's a good idea to work on a smooth surface or put down a cloth because cutting tiles can be really quite messy. But without further ado, and with all of our materials gathered, let's make a start. First thing I wanted for my coaster was to create a border around it, and this is for two reasons. Firstly, it makes the coaster look nice and neat and finished. The crazy paving style can look really quite haphazard, and by framing it in with a border like this, it looks much more like it was intentional. And having a border also creates a nice smooth boundary, so there's no sharp bits around the edges. It means that it feels much better when it's handled. Before you start cutting your tiles, it's a good idea to remove any backing that might be on them. If it's plastic, you'll probably find you have to soak it off, but if it's just paper backing like this, then it can just be peeled away. Then, using the nippers, cut the tiles first into quarters, and then cut each of those quarters in half again. This should give you a nice, neat little rectangle that's fairly even in width. Don't worry if it's not perfect. At the end of the day, this is a homemade project. It's not something that's been mass-produced in a factory, and so a few wonky lines here and there just add some character to the piece. Apply a very fine line of glue to the edge of your coaster blank, enough just to stick the pieces down, but not so much that it oozes out from underneath the tiles. You can see here where I've clearly added far too much glue. Then you can start sticking the border down, taking care to keep the distance between each of the tiles as even as possible. The most important part of the coaster is its edge, as that's the part that everyone's going to notice because it gives the coaster its shape. So this is really the part that you need to be the most careful with. Follow the edge of the wood as closely as you can and try to keep everything nice and smooth. Once you've finished the border, you can set it to one side, and then we're going to cut out some of our crazy paving tiles. For this project, I'm going to be filling in the whole of the centre with this lovely dusty pink colour, and just a few of these mint green ones thrown in as well for contrast. To create a good, crazy paving effect, you need to follow two golden rules. Number one, no lines. It is really easy when trying to create crazy paving to start following an imaginary line. In small doses, this is fine. But you can see here on this lizard piece, for example, that I made, I've accidentally made two particularly bad lines. There's one here, and there's one here. You don't see them at first, but once you have, they really stand out because they break the pattern of the crazy paving. And so to avoid that, make sure you change direction as frequently as you can when creating crazy paving. The other rule is to keep your pieces the same size, if at all possible. It looks much better if you try to keep all of the tiles looking roughly the same so that they form more of a repeating pattern. Going back to my lizard piece again, you can see very clearly where I've used lots of small tiles to try and fill in spaces, and the result is really quite messy compared to this patch here where I've done a better job of keeping them all the same size. And so the first thing you want to do is to cut some tiles out, to be honest. When working with square tiles like this, I like to cut them roughly into quarters in order to keep the size consistent, but to really vary the angle in between the cuts. Otherwise, you will end up with just another load of squares. And so try to keep all of your cuts on an angle if you possibly can. And to begin with, it's worth cutting out a batch of them, a small handful, say 15 to 20, just so that you can have a play with arranging them in the space that you want to fill. Because the tiles are very close together and quite small, when doing crazy paving, it's much easier to stick them down as you go, rather than trying to arrange them first and then stick them down afterwards. Go around the border first, because as has been said, this is the most important part to make sure that you get right. This is the bit that people are really going to be noticing when they look at your coaster, and then once you've done that, you can start filling in the middle. Try to keep the gaps in between the tiles as even as possible as you can as well. There will always be some variation, just try not to let it get too out of hand. As you work at filling in the coaster, you'll find that the spaces that you need to fill are getting smaller and smaller and narrower, and so you're probably going to have to start trying to cut them specifically to fit a space. If you can do this by eye, then that is absolutely fantastic and the ideal. If not, then you might want to use a pencil, and preferably a white one so that it doesn't stand out, and then you can use that just to mark on where you want to cut off. It just makes things a little bit easier if you're struggling to decide where to put a cut. And then, once you've filled your entire coaster, it's time to set it to one side to allow that glue to completely dry. And then once it's dry, we can start looking at grouting. For larger projects, it's worth wearing gloves to protect your hands, but for smaller ones like this, I often just use my fingers when I'm spreading grout over the surface of the mosaic. As you do so, press it into all of the little spaces until the whole thing is completely covered in grout with no gaps, including going around all of the edges. You can then use a finger to gently remove the majority of the grout. You're not aiming for anything like a perfect finish yet, you just want to remove enough so that we can clearly see the tiles underneath once again. Then set this to one side and leave it to dry for about 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, it should be dry enough for you to then use a damp cloth, like a J-cloth sort of thing that I'm using, just to remove the remaining grout. Take care to remove as much as you can from the base and the sides as well. You don't want anything left on there that's going to be a bit unsightly. And at this point, you are aiming to get your project as neat as you possibly can. This is actually, to me, one of the most pleasing parts of making a mosaic, because it's when the pattern really starts coming to life. It starts to look like a unified whole rather than just a bunch of little things stuck on a piece of wood. Once you've removed as much of the grout as you can, leave the project to dry once again. And now you can just buff away those last few bits of grout if you happen to have any remaining on the tiles, leaving you with a completed coaster. So long as your grout is completely dry, it should be ready to use. And that is how you create a very simple, crazy paving style mosaic coaster. And you can of course apply this style to any project that you might be working on at the moment. So long as you follow those two golden rules of no lines, trying your best to keep all the pieces the same size, then you should be able to create a really nice effect. But I hope you've enjoyed this little video. Have fun crafting everyone, enjoy those mosaics, and I'll see you again soon. Bye bye!